Hello and welcome to the Just Make and Do shed build video. In this, I hope to help you answer the question, should I build my shed myself or should I leave it to the professionals? Here's the result that we've ended up with, but let's jump back in time to see where it all began. The little garden shed that you see here served its purpose for the few years that we've been in the house, but we both decided that having a bit more space for storage and a bit more area for me to do my projects would be ideal. You can see more of those over at Rob Art Hunt on Instagram. The space behind this shed here wasn't really being utilised well. The garden wasn't really our favourite part of the garden and we weren't really using that. And although it wasn't usually this messy, the shed had definitely experienced growing pains and we pulled the trigger on getting something bigger. I'm sure if you're watching this video, you don't need help finding reasons to get a bigger shed. This is the online portal available through Widespan Sheds, and I found it really helpful and not just a bit of a fun gimmick. It really helped us decide the different layout of the shed, and I think the result that we've gone for was quite similar to the portal's version. As you can see in this second version of the portal, we were able to change a few things, including the size, the amount of windows, the colour, the placement of the door, and it really did help using this portal to visualise what we were wanting and then go out and measure what we could fit and go from there. At this point, we were presented with our first sort of catch-22 of the whole process, whereby you have to pay a 15% deposit to the shed company to receive the documentation that you're looking at now. We then submitted that to council in order to get a council application for the shed building approved. I don't think there's any way to get your 15% deposit back if council did deny your application, and I saw horror stories of that being the case. So my first big tip is to do your research on what your council will likely allow before committing to the 15% deposit. Here you can see the construction plan, the bill of materials, and a couple of plan documentations that you could thoroughly read in the 6 to 8 weeks that it takes for your shed to be built and delivered, manufactured and delivered while you're waiting. It's a really good idea to go over these, print them out, and get very familiar with them. If you are going to build your own shed and not leave it to the professionals, having a really good understanding of all these documents will very much help. Week 1, the fun begins, the demo. I didn't even bother getting a quote for demolition experts to come in and knock down my shed. It's pretty tiny, it's pretty easy to dismantle, it was quite a bit of fun, and I kept most of the materials that I could for use in new projects, so I just decided to do it myself. That led into what you're looking at now, which was the demo of the slab. I hired that Hilti jackhammer for about $160 for, I think, a weekend. It was probably overspec'd for what I needed, but it was a bit of fun demolishing the slab with such a good hammer. Next up came the removal of that slab into the skip bin that you'll see. But in terms of the demolition, it was a bit easier than I expected because the slab wasn't as thick through the middle as it appeared throughout the edges. Then came another fun bit, borrowing my neighbour's tractor to pull up the Rio to make the concrete all broken up and easier to remove. It was just a bit of fun having this. You could do it without it, but it did make the whole job a lot easier. After this, we had to load up the wheelbarrow that you see before you and make quite a few trips out the garden lane and into this skip bin. Next big tip, get a skip bin. I was going to do multiple ute loads down to the dump because I thought it might be cheaper and it might be easier. I don't think it would have been cheaper, and it definitely wouldn't have been easier. And it was the first time that I've hired a skip bin, but I would definitely recommend it, and I'll definitely be doing it again. And this was a 3 cubic metre skip bin, which happened to be enough because I packed it fairly well, so The space that you saw that had to be taken out, including the path and the old shed slab, was approximately 13 square metres, and that all fit with a bit of other garden junk in a 3 cubic metre bin. Then we're on to levelling the site, ready for the new slab. I still had my neighbour's tractor and I was still having fun driving it around, so I thoroughly recommend, if you have got access to something like that, getting one. However, it could have been done with just a shovel and a lot of hard work. You'll see that the tree over behind the tractor was one that also had to come down. You may or may not have to deal with the same sort of thing, but that came down at that stage. This was a bit of a Catherine Zeta-Jones moment for me, where I got my laser out at night and threw dust to make sure that the various points of the slab were level, which they appeared to be. After that, we got the soil test as required, maybe by council. It was recommended in the shed build plan, so I thought it was a good idea, while the ground was accessible, to go ahead and find out what we were dealing with. And now we're on to the fun bit, the slab pour. I didn't get any photos of the boxing for the slab because it was done by my concreter, so apologies for that. And you will notice that the break in the timeline between the soil test and the slab pour was quite a bit, maybe 6 weeks, mainly due to his availability. So just be aware of that. If you really have a timeline to get it done, you might want to lock it in early. However, the shed hadn't arrived by the time that the slab pour happened anyway, so be aware that the delay on receiving the materials might give you a bit of time to organise that anyway. The slab was poured quite well. I'm very happy with it. You will notice at the end though that they actually ran short, so even though the professionals were doing it, they can make mistakes, and it was nice to have it as their problem to mix more concrete rather than mine, so probably got out of jail there. This cost me $3,000 in South Australia in late 2024, and it was a good choice to go with that instead of doing it myself, which I was considering. I think it would have been quite stressful if I'd run short, would have been quite stressful if the slab wasn't level thanks to my handiwork. So my tip would be go with the pros, because it would have been close to $2,000 for me to do it anyway, and I am very happy that I got the pros in and I was just running wheelbarrows of concrete. Once the slab dried, you can see that front bit where they had to mix different concrete. It turned out to be a different colour. Now that the slab is sealed, you can't notice that, and the concreter assured me that it won't have any problems in the future. So I took the leap of faith and trusted him, and it's been fine so far. And then the big day arrived. The shed was delivered midweek. It was probably good that I was here to receive it, to tell them exactly where to put it, because something that happened with me, and it could happen with you, is the communication between the shed company, the suppliers and the deliverers. Things get lost in translation and they miss things. So just be aware that it is handy, if you can do it, to be available to receive your wonderful shed, which might look something like this. First up, I decided to mark out the lines where the columns had to go. Although the professionals did do my slab and did, in my opinion, a good job, the slab's not perfectly square, and the very back corner is the only one that I thought was almost exactly 90 degrees. So I worked off that, measuring the slab on each end and calculating the difference and doing the lines as an almost perfect rectangle based off that. Then I was able to start laying out the columns where they should go. This was the first case, apart from the slab pour obviously, where it was really handy having 2 people. So having someone hold the other end of your string, having someone hold the other end of the column. There are many times when you're building your shed where it's handy to have 2 people. So if you're like me and you like working alone because you just like to get the job done, you have to accept that you're going to need help quite a lot if you want to get the best result possible. What you're looking at now is my little helper, and another thing to be aware of is if you're a parent or if you've got a full-time job, a bit like me in both cases, it is harder to get your shed done quickly. And our little helper there probably slowed things down a lot whenever she was on site. So for safety reasons and practicality, you have to be aware that you're going to need help, either babysitting and or actual help on site. The scope of this video changed while I was building the shed because I realised to some extent I don't know what I'm doing. So I did make mistakes and I did work out how to do things in different ways. And for that reason, I'm going to put a link to a few fantastic videos online already on YouTube that I'd highly recommend you watch in their entirety, maybe more than once before you build your shed, because you'll be a lot more confident and you'll make fewer mistakes having seen other people make the mistakes first up. At this point, I was drilling holes for the columns brackets that go into the column, and thankfully I did them all well because I didn't have to redo any for the entirety of the shed. And I was also working towards the standing of the walls. I did see another person stand each bay individually. That could be a good idea if you tack the girts to the columns individually and then use proper screws to do them when you want to connect them both together. If you've got more than two, connect them all together. That could really help you get each bay upright and square and plumb without knocking out the next one when you make any adjustment there. So my tip would be, first and foremost, watch the videos that I'll link below, and then secondly, consider that there's more than one way of doing most processes on site and then choosing the best way. Because this video is not hugely informative, I'll just start beaming some tips out that might help you in your build. The yellow and silver platform ladder that you see before you was really handy for the whole build, and I'd be very reluctant to do another shed without one, even if it's just because you can send someone else up that and you go up the less sturdy A-frame ladder. I felt a lot more confident in precarious situations on the platform ladder because it's more sturdy and it's adjustable and it's just better. Another thing I'd mention is access. I've got fairly bad access in various points around my shed. There's not much I could do about it, and it sucks. When you're building, it's more dangerous, it's less fun, and it's more time consuming. If you can build with more access around, then fantastic. If you can't, I understand, I couldn't, but more access is just more enjoyable in many different ways. This was what we were dealing with at about the 10-week mark, I forget, but at this point we really got a scale of this shed and got a feel for how big it would be, and we were really happy with it. Given this vision's not very enthralling, I'll wind back the clock to council approval and recommend that you apply for it. I have heard stories of people building sheds without council approval, and that might be fine on the farm, but when you're in a city, there's more likely a chance that you'll get into trouble for it and maybe have to pull it down, and that would be heartbreaking. So I highly recommend council approval. For mine, nothing was happening for a couple of weeks, so I politely went and inquired in person at the council chambers. Before I left the car park, the shed had been approved. So it just goes to show the greasy wheel sometimes gets the oil. Here we have the roller door turning up about 2 weeks after the bulk of the shed turned up. The flashings and the roller door are supplied by an external supplier. They're a massive company, and sadly they don't really care too much about the small guy, to the extent that there could be a delay and there's not much you can do about it. So although I'm calling the shed practically complete and it's January, there still is flashing on the shed that was not the correct colour when it was delivered and isn't corrected yet. Widespan sheds made me aware that I need to check everything when it arrives, but that's also a bit of a catch-22 in that if you open these packs, then they're lying out everywhere, and it's known by everyone in shed building that it's very hard to do this, but technically you're meant to. So that's just something that you should be aware of. If you can check everything when it arrives, you will benefit. At some point during your shed build, you're going to have to trim corrugated iron to the angle of the top of your shed. The two cutters on the left I thought were crap, and the one on the right, the deviate one, I thought was really good. There is still quite an art to trimming corrugated iron, and that's something you have to learn when you're on site. And I would highly recommend trimming the tops that need to be cut on an angle while they're down on the ground. It's a real pain in the bum if you try and trim them when they're already connected to your shed and they're up at height. Then we get to the all-important costs. This shed is 7 metres by 4.5. At the high point it's 3 metres and the lower end of the roof is 2.5 metres. I've discovered that once you go from a flimsy little garden shed up to something like this, the cost doesn't go up much when you make the shed a lot bigger. So for that reason, and because it's a lot cheaper to do it the first time than try and come back and increase the size of a shed later, it is far cheaper to go as big as you can at the start. And I'm very glad that my wife pushed me towards that. And we've got the biggest shed that we could fit in the space that we had, and I'd recommend you do the same. Obviously, if you've got a paddock, you have to be a bit sensible, but go ham. Doing a walkthrough in the practically completed shed, I feel that the initial 3D render on the computer was fairly accurate and really did help us get an idea of the layout when the shed was done. We're super happy with adding windows because it gives us a look out in the backyard. We really like the roller door and the glass sliding door letting in a lot of light. And there's not too much I'd change, thanks largely to that initial 3D render giving us a really good idea about what to expect. And now the all-important question, should I build the shed myself or should I pay the professionals? I got quoted $8,000 to build this shed, which I thought was quite steep. If you're a handy person, I think you could do it yourself. You will constantly need the help of someone else just to hold something, so just be aware of that. The third option I thought of while building the shed would be to pay a carpenter to lead the build and you help them. I think for the cost of the hourly rate of the carpenter, that would be my preferred option if I was doing it again, and I'd have a lot of peace of mind that I'd make less mistakes and still really get a lot of satisfaction out of the build and enjoy it. I've still got to do the concrete steps, as you can see, and various other things around the shed, and the correct flashing colour hasn't turned up in certain instances still. However, it feels finished. I'm really enjoying being in there and doing work out of it already, and as you can see, the whole family's enjoying it. So I thoroughly recommend that you give it a go if you think you're up to it. And feel free to give this video a like, seeing as you've made it to the end.